Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Jennifer, hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Matt?
Good. We're finally meeting, sort of technologically in person, and I know we've been chatting a little bit through messages, but I've really wanted to have this conversation, and I wish we even had more time to talk about all this stuff. But your new book, Levi's Unbuttoned, The Woke Mob Took My Job But Gave Me My Voice. How long has it been out now?
It's just a few days, actually, not even a week, less than a
Okay.
week, 4 or 5 days.
How is it going so far?
It's going. I want to get it in people's hands. I want people to read it. I want to hear what they think. So, still out here talking to folks like you and hoping people spread the word because
Yeah.
I think it's going to resonate. I think it's different maybe than what some people expect. I think first and foremost, it really is a kind of call to action for people to kind of stand up and use their voices and push back on any narrative that they think is faulty or untrue. We know that about 2/3 of Americans say they don't say what they really think. And I think this is really damaging and problematic for a million reasons, which we can talk about. But it's also a memoir. There's some personal stuff. It's not just about woke capitalism. It is a lot about that because I certainly ran headlong into it and lost my job because of it. But it's my sort of personal story of being able to come to finding the confidence to use my own voice.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a classic hero's journey the way I read the book because it sort of follows the arc of your career, the challenges you faced, and then you found your dream job, and then you had to make what had to be. I just can't even imagine making that decision, essentially leaving the career and even the family that you had loved for so long. And so why don't you? I mean, I first read your story when you published that piece on Barry Weiss's website, and that I guess was kind of your last day on the job or something, right? Or soon
Yeah,
after.
I mean, I technically resigned, and I did resign. I wasn't fired, but I was told there wasn't a job for me anymore in the company. I was offered severance. Severance always comes with a non-disclosure agreement about the terms of the separation, and I felt it was really important to speak about the terms of this separation because I did not want to leave. I was doing a good job. Our business was in great shape. All of the warnings that me using my voice about closed schools in defense of children, all of those warnings that was going to be damaging to the company's reputation, the stock price, sales, et cetera, none of that came true. But I went against the prevailing narrative, in this case, the Democratic Party narrative. And it became the woke narrative that, if you didn't want to stay home, lock your kids in their room and isolate them, you were a very, very bad person
Yeah.
that wanted to kill people. And it was a very difficult decision. I did not accept the severance because I did not want to sign the non-disclosure agreement, and I resigned very publicly. And that's when you saw the story on Barry's Common Sense Substack. And I told the story of how I was essentially pushed out for speaking up in defense of children.
So as I recall, it cost you $1 million to buy your voice back. Was that a difficult decision?
Sure,
Yeah.
that's a lot of financial security,
Right.
Look, I'm not pretending to be anyone I'm not. I was an executive for many years. I did well. I had the financial freedom to move my family to Colorado I lived in California before that, so that my kids could go to school. They go to public school, but I wanted them to be in school, and I had the freedom to do that. I recognize that a lot of folks don't have that opportunity, and um, people shouldn't have to choose between their career, their children, their voice, their beliefs. And yet, what my story seems to say is that using your voice, in my case, in defense of children, is an HR violation. I mean, it's enraging.
Yeah.
It
It's
was a
almost
very
crazy.
difficult choice.
Yeah, it's
It's
a crazy
crazy.
thing to say out loud that you would be punished for. And this week we could get into to COVID because I certainly my career trajectory and the business that we do at Free the People was always meant to be sort of transpartisan, reaching across partisan divides and finding those common issues and common values that might hold people together. But when lockdowns happened, I had the same reaction you did. I'm like, this is the most insane punishing of people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Like I was thinking about it as an economist, and you were perhaps thinking about it as a mom who saw the damage being done to kids. But it was so obvious from day one that this would be insanely destructive and that the destruction would not hit everybody equally, and to be punished for voicing those concerns, particularly from the woke left. I'm still trying to figure out exactly why that's happening.
I think that's right. I'm still by it because it seems to be such a violation of the values that they profess to hold dear.
Yeah.
Protection of children, of the underclass, equality. I mean, we denied equality of opportunity, not just to children with closed schools, but to small business owners, and the folks who had the least suffered the most. And we know it was the largest upward transfer of wealth ever, basically. So the very rich, not just the rich, but the very rich got much, much, much richer. And everybody else suffered. 25 million people were laid off due to lockdowns. Where was the outrage? Everyone's mad about Elon Musk laying off 3,700 well-paid tech workers. It's still enraging to me to this day. 25 million people lost their jobs. These were largely underinsured, hourly wage workers with no savings to get them through. And all people shouted about was, well, we need to send them $1,000 check. How long do you think that lasted, that $1,000?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not very long. And so it seemed such an obvious trespass of the values the left claimed to hold so dear. And the hypocrisy, it was driving me insane. I couldn't stop even when I knew my job was at risk. And I will tell you, there was a real moment of truth for me, which was in the fall of 2020 when all the private schools opened in my city where I used to live, of San Francisco. All my peers sent their kids back to private school and told me I had to stay quiet about public school children.
Yeah.
And there was no turning back for me. It just exposed the whole lie. And I was like, you're all liars.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this whole have versus have not created by COVID, because my reaction as an economist early on, you may remember that there was a hashtag stay the fuck home. And I thought about it. I'm like, what if you actually meant that and everybody had to stay home? It would be a unspeakable catastrophe. People would start starving to death in a couple of weeks, and it would start obviously with people at the margins, not people with ice cream packed in their freezer, like you know who. I won't mention her, but obviously that's not what they really meant. They meant that those people who are privileged enough to have the wealth and the safety to stay home, they would stay home, and they would expect so-called essential workers to produce the food somehow. They don't know how food is produced, but they're going to produce it. And as long as that Uber Eats driver comes to their door with it, you're doing the virtuous thing. And it's so insanely elitist and out of touch.
It's grotesque. It really is. And there was no other way it was going to work. How were these wealthy people going to get their food, to your point? And by the way, they had pods for their kids. I mean, the ones who weren't truly, truly desperately afraid, which was a lot of people, they had learning pods and they hired tutors. And when private schools opened, you bet they sent them back. They weren't too afraid to do that. And yet this idea that the virtuous thing to do, the noble, the good thing to do was to say, stay the fuck home, and order your Uber Eats and watch Netflix. That wasn't virtuous. It was incredibly harmful to the vast majority of people. I think Dr. Jay Bhattacharya calls it trickle down epidemiology, and it was supposed to sort of protect these other folks. And, very early on in a conversation that I had with a family member that was very revealing to me, he said, well, we have to just protect who we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's it. You just said the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't care.
I mean, there's this. I don't think there's actual self-awareness on this hypocrisy, and it gets to a central theme in your book that it was a cult, and I refer to it as a religion because you can't question the tenets of these principles because they're articles of faith, and they're not to be questioned. The science was the religion, and the science was utterly unscientific. When did it be? When did the cult happen? Like, I'm trying to figure out. And by the way, the cult is absolutely lockdowns, but it's also wokeness and intersectionality, and now it might even be unwavering support for infinite resources to Ukraine. And these things don't seem to have anything in common, and yet it's all the same thing.
Yeah. If you understand the answer of how those things are connected, I would like you to tell me. I don't totally get it, and I think about it a lot. I think the commonality is that you cannot question that it is religious in nature. It provides a framework for how to make decisions and how to be on the good side, how to be on the right of virtue. I think in a world that is increasingly secular, people still have a religious impulse. I say this as an atheist, and I also say this as an atheist. I think religion is better. This is, it's providing people with this framework for right and wrong. They want to be on the good team more than they want to actually be right. They don't want to have to think about it or question, and so they adopt these dictates, whether they make any sense or not. And they think not only are they the virtuous ones, they think they're the smart ones, which also drives me crazy because they're not reading anything. They're not well informed. They're watching the chyrons on CNN saying, you're all going to die. Don't leave the house, which was always a lie. And it justifies such tremendous harm to others. When I think about people I thought were good people who advocated vociferously for people to lose their jobs and not receive medical treatment because they declined the vaccine. This is cruel and indecent treatment. But because they're the good people, that's what makes it religious. I like your terminology, and it is cult-like. I recently rewatched Going Clear, the documentary about Scientology, and I was like, they're just like him, this Miscavige who runs Scientology. And this idea that you have to disconnect from people that don't believe or that ask questions, they call it disconnection, I think, in Scientology. That's been practiced. These people are so evil, if they even dare ask a question, that you must shun them.
Yeah, yeah. It's dehumanizing, and as the phrase, I guess, is othering, whatever that tribe or category of humans is. You want to dehumanize them so that you can actually, like, I never thought I would see this in the United States, the idea that people would proudly say that person should be denied medical care because of a choice that they made, and we wouldn't do that to people that make all sorts of horrible choices in their lives.
It's just not harm others.
Not what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this was something that got me all revved up, and it was something I was told I should never comment on. And I actually, in fact, conceded to my peers' demands and deleted some of the social media posts I'd made on this. But I agree with you. I never thought I'd see something like this, not in this country. It's a clear violation of the Hippocratic Oath. And yet in the fall of 21, doctors were writing op-eds like mad saying they need to be denied treatment. Drunk drivers who kill other people are treated at the hospital. Active shooters are given treatment. And yet somehow an unvaccinated person is so evil that they should not receive medical treatment. Now, I have a theory that the purpose of those op-eds as they were written was not so much to get doctors to deny the treatment, but to make other people hate the unvaccinated and to really create division, which worked.
Yeah.
It worked.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. So, I mean, I have half-baked theories on what might be going on, and and I'll test some of them on you, and you tell me if I'm crazy. But I think, if civics has become a religion, and particularly kind of a centralized vision for how society should function, sort of a techno-authoritarian. We're all going to get vaccinated. We're going to let experts decide who's essential and non-essential, and we could list 1,000 things that was done in this. The problem is if you deviate from the faith, you make it very difficult for them to impose those things from the top down. So I think it's part of our broader problem of both centralizing power in Washington, D.C. and making it such a tribal fight between this team and that team, and whoever's in charge gets to start doing what they want to the rest of us. So I think it's if you want to centralize everything like that, you cannot allow for dissident voices because they screw up everything. They break up the sense that you're right. I think that's part of what's going on.
I think that's correct. And I think in order to drive towards the type of system that you just described, this sort of centralized, very bureaucratic, inhumane system, you have to deny the humanity of the individual because it becomes all about the collective and the group. And we're told that that's better. But the individual's humanity is utterly denied. And so anyone who strays is retaining their humanity. They're retaining their own ability to think and their voice. And that is a danger to the system that only values the collective. And this country, I thought, was built on this sort of notion of individual rights and rugged individualism. And I think that's why my story, I wasn't going to try to come back to this, but why it resonated so much, because Levi's was this brand that kind of embodied those values of rugged individualism. It's sort of like the epitome of those American values. And so for this company to trespass against those values in such an obvious way, it's also such a well-known brand. Like, it's not like it's Salesforce, which is a much bigger company, but no one knows what they do, right? Everybody's got a pair of Levi's. And so it felt very familiar. But that denial of the individual, and that's why I say, even as an atheist, I found myself amongst this new group of friends who have, fought for the rights of the individual during this time. Many of them, not all, but many, are religious from various walks of life and different religions. And the thing that I see that they all have in common is they do value sort of the soul and the spirit of human beings. And that seems to be lost in the science, for sure.
Yeah, there's, and I'm sure everybody tells you a story about their favorite pair of Levi's, but I still have, by the way, we've been joined by one of my cats. He's a co-producer on the show. So
I love it.
He does not have a pair of Levi's, but I still have the pair when I was loading trucks at UPS at night in graduate school, and this pair, the entire front of the leg is worn off because you're leaning against the conveyor belt, and I can't throw those guys away. You're going to hang up this whole show, buddy. Stop.
Your story, everyone does have a Levi's story, and our whole campaign that I initiated or led back in 2014 was based on that idea. And it's exactly for the reason you just said. there's memories built into them. They bear the markings of your life in a sense. So
Yeah.
the memory you just had is evidence of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, how did and this gets to your story and maybe answers the question. You're screwing up the entire shoot, buddy. Stop. My cats are very libertarian, so they tend to do whatever they want. Um,
I like it.
the so something happened from. I mean, Levi's was this very rugged individualist thing, and certainly, and you point out in the book that the family and the executives at Levi's are very progressive, democratic. But when did it go from what I would call classic liberal values to woke authoritarian values? Because to me, it's fundamentally different.
Yeah, I agree. There's a fundamental difference there. I think it happened slowly and then suddenly all at once. I would say it didn't really start in earnest until probably around 2017. So, this is not a long-standing thing. Now, I do iterate this in the book. Levi's is a company that for a very long time has taken what I would call bold stance to take care of their employees. So they integrated factories before the law required it in the 50s and 60s, and employees were mad about it. Employees quit, but they said, "We're doing this. It's the right thing to do." I mean, I wasn't there, but I imagine that's what they said. They offered same-sex partner benefits in 1992, first Fortune 500 company to do so. I applaud this. I was proud of these things. I think offering more equality to your employees is a good thing. But this, and sort of turning those political beliefs outward, not really driving any action off of them, just doing it to virtue signal, that started probably around 2017, 2018, and then just was lit on fire during COVID. And then, of course, in the summer of 2020 with all the protests, when every single company just had to signal how much they really, really, really care. Now, there weren't really clear actions associated with any of this care. And at the same time, most companies were taking actions that harmed the lowest paid workers.
One thing I haven't heard you talk about and trying to understand why capitalism became so woke, because the phrase that I think I got from you is woke capitalism, which I think is a great descriptor for this somewhat mysterious virtue signaling, almost struggle session version of corporate culture. That's a little bit different than things I've seen in the past. And I was thinking about, you've also mentioned our good friend, I can never get his acronym right. Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. I assume you've seen this conversation he had with, I think, Vox.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where and Vox asks him, "You're really good at talking about ethics for someone who kind of saw it all as a game with winners and losers." And he says, "Yeah, he, I had to be. It's what reputations are made of to some extent. I feel bad for those who get fucked by it." So,
well, then say the next part. He said, "It's a game woke Westerners play so people like us."
yeah. But this dumb game we woke Westerners play where we say all the right shibboleths so that everyone likes us. He's kind of admitting what the whole game is, right?
He said the whole thing out loud.
Yeah.
He said it all. Now, I think the difference between him and many others is I think others aren't so aware that that's what they're doing. I think they embrace it and believe it. And I think one of the things that drives it, and I do write about this at length because I've had to think about it. It used to be business and capitalism was the purview of the right and everyone accepted it. Greed was good. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that the party dynamics have essentially shifted, right? And you have the left is the party of the elite, and you have tech companies led by, woke lefties. And I think they feel a little guilty about the fact that they're super rich. And that, guess what? Underneath that richness is some greed. They want to be rich. You don't get really rich by accident. You don't. Sorry, you don't stumble upon $1 billion by accident. That's what you're going for. You can call it effective altruism and you can say you want to give it away. It's bullshit. So I think their guilt. In the past, the banking leaders and oil barons and Wall Streeters, like, they didn't feel guilty about it. They loved it. They celebrated it. They said greed was good. These folks feel a little guilty about it, so they wrap this woke cloak around themselves to signal that they are in fact good. They are really social justice warriors. They would have gone into nonprofit or teaching, but felt they could make a bigger difference this way.
Yeah.
And it's a line of crap, but they do start to believe it themselves after a while.
I suppose they start believing it and it makes them feel better, but also as a practical business strategy for cynical business people trying to game the system. Like, if you had played the game, the woke mob would not have gone after you.
Yeah, if I had tweeted all day long about how stay the fuck home and keep the schools closed forever, and if you don't want to, you're a horrible person that wants teachers to die, I would have gotten promoted again, right? Like, that was an acceptable position to have. And so I think you're right. The second piece of it is I do think they think it's good business strategy, and they think that younger consumers, Gen Zs and millennials, it's an attempt to really sort of profit and commoditize their activism, which in and of itself is sort of grotesque, to commoditize activism. Now, we can debate how real and authentic that activism is. Like, if your activism is buying a t-shirt with a rainbow Nike swoosh on it, I kind of question the legitimacy of that. So the companies make it really easy for consumers to feel virtuous, because all they need to do, they don't really have to put anything on the line. They just have to buy the t-shirt. So it's this pact in a weird way where do nothing, but get all the kind of virtue halo of having done something. They like to talk about themselves, both the leaders and the consumers, as good trouble. They're no trouble at all. All they want to do is fit in. They'd rather fit in than do the right thing. And I ran into that headlong. One of the things I've been thinking about in the last few days is, in addition to being sort of a dissident or a kind of unwilling to accept this woke ideology, it made me a traitor to my class in a sense as well. And I think I've only sort of come to this in the last day or two, but that was also punishable, because the pact is, we don't tell anyone what SBF told that reporter. He thought he was telling a peer that would keep his secret because she was in on it too. That's why he had no qualms about saying it. I wasn't supposed to notice. And if I noticed, I certainly wasn't supposed to say it. And I wasn't supposed to expose anyone as fraudulent. And I did. And you can't have that, because the whole thing comes tumbling down, potentially, if enough people question it.
Yeah, and that goes to that there cannot be deviation from the faith. The other half, I mean, I'm sure it's just a coincidence that FTX was pouring apparently billions of dollars into one party that happened to control the White House and both houses of Congress. So there's a bit of a public choice story here, where they're buying influence. They're buying. In this case, we're going to look the other way, because we can't. We're culpable too. Our hands are dirty. So we're just going to look the other way as this whole thing bilks, billions from people.
Well, and that's the danger, is, what he purchased with his money was, no one was going to scrutinize what was going on here. And it took all of 3 seconds for somebody to actually look at the balance sheet and the P&L and go, this is full of air. There's nothing here. There's no there. There's no corporate controls. None of this makes any sense. It's a big Ponzi scheme. It was all there. The same could be said of WeWork, which eventually basically collapsed. I mean, it still exists, but it went from sort of close to $50 billion valuation to $5. There was no there either. But all of this woke hand waving and arm waving sort of bought them a pass, right? It bought them a pass, and no one looked into it and no one scrutinized it. It's interesting. I was watching the documentary the other night about the WeWork guy, Adam Newman, and Derek Thompson is in it. And, you know, the reporter from the Atlantic, and he talks about, and they show a little snippet of an interview he'd done with him. And he says in it, in my mind, I was sort of wondering if this was legit, but I didn't want to say anything. And so, you know, the journalists fall prey to this influence as well. And they fall prey to this kind of business leaders cloaking themselves in these woke causes and everybody cheering for them. Look at Elizabeth Holmes. Everybody put her on a magazine cover. Nobody wanted to question her intentions or her authenticity or if her frickin' business worked at all.
Yeah.
They didn't until it was too late. And the danger here is when we create this culture, either in business or in the world at large, where you cannot question bad things happen. Bad things happen in business, corruption, theft, criminality, and bad things happen in the world, you know, and we certainly don't have a culture of free speech when anyone who questions the narrative is demonized. We don't. We just have propaganda.
If you made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we created for the people. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. I mean, we're getting at economic structures and perverse incentives that create this closed top-down system, and I think most corporate media falls into that category. They have the same masters as the political class and woke corporate America, which I think helps explain why everyone's freaking out about Elon Musk, right? So the one guy that is I mean, he's not even a free speech radical. He's just like, I want a more open platform, and there was apparently this system where there are official narratives that are allowed and those that aren't allowed, and a lot of this is being dictated from the government itself at the Department of Homeland Security of all places. So I think again they're like trying to do whack-a-mole where you know, you didn't comply and now you're a problem. Elon Musk in a bigger way, because I think he's got a bigger bankroll than you do. He's not complying, and so they're trying so desperately to control the narrative. But this is why I'm ultimately an optimist, even though we've had a very pessimistic conversation so far. I think it's very difficult to get people to shut up because we're
some people.
Yeah. We're Americans. Like, you know, people outside the system, like we have hopefully the freedom to do that still in this country, and I think that's what they hate the most.
I think it's very difficult to get a very small percentage of people to shut up. People like us. I think it's, I don't know, 5, 6, 7%. It's a small number. But eventually we chip away at it and people join and become the majority. It can take a very long time, but my optimism comes from the idea that I may sound like a naive idiot. I think eventually truth does win out.
Yeah.
And, you know, my experience with this came from my, you know, gymnastics career. I was an elite athlete as a child. It's a really abusive sport. 20 years after I left the sport, I still suffered. I spoke out about it. I was dragged across the internet for 10 years. And eventually everyone came around and said, oh, she's telling the truth.
Yeah.
It took 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the same thing is happening. We haven't talked about your husband yet and those tweets that got you in so much trouble. But I think, you know, your critique of masking kids and closing schools, even at this point, seems like an obvious thing. Everybody acknowledges that it was a mistake. I don't think anyone's taking responsibility for the mistakes that they made. And I think that will be true on lockdowns. You mentioned Jay Bhattacharya, and I think he and those dissident epidemiologists are now being vindicated. So hopefully it doesn't take 10 years because, you know, if we're not proven to have been correct, they're just going to do it again. So I think it's important to speak out. That's probably why we're both doing it. And I want to get back to the book specifically because there's something that to me was one of the most rending parts of the books. The you know what your stance did to your family. And how it divided you with your brother and your parents. Tell that story if you would.
Yeah, I mean, my parents are older; they're 80. They were really, really terrified, and look, they're in a high risk group. I'm not going to say that they aren't, and I would never advocate for them to not keep themselves as safe as they possibly could. And so we argued. They did not agree with my views. They bought into the media narrative hook, line, and sinker. To my parents' credit, despite the fact that we argued and it got quite heated at times, my dad especially, we kept talking the whole time. We never stopped talking. He never didn't read the things I sent him. He stayed open in his own way. Now, in moments of panic, he was inappropriate, and I include some things he said to me and my husband on social media, but we always kept the lines of communication open. I think that's important. And my parents and I have had other struggles over the years, and we always sort of stick with it, All I'm asking for people to do is to hear each other out, and they did that. We are closer now in our view, not 100% aligned. And one of the things I'm really angry about is they're still quite afraid, at least my mom is, to see people. And here she is in the later part of her life, and she's spending it at home terrified.
Yeah.
I'm mad about that. I'm really angry about that. She's not seeing her grandchildren because she's scared. The thing that should bring older people joy in the end of their life. But like I said, we continued talking. It was heated at times. My brother and I do not speak anymore. It was very heated from the very beginning. He disapproved of mine and my husband's views. And what I will never quite totally understand is why we went from disagreeing to my husband and I, in his mind, being literally the incarnation of evil. How did that happen? How did we get here as a country? How did my family get here? But he became one of my trolls, essentially, on Twitter, and interacted with people who were tagging my company and writing boycott Levi's. And he's, even after I left the company, I don't think he was very happy with, because the coverage was, I would say, fair by and large. Neutral to positive, fair. I wasn't positioned by and large as an insane lunatic who deserved to be fired. And I don't think he liked that. And he pitched stories to people. Kara Swisher, a journalist with 1.5 million followers, that the story is not as it seems. She's corrupted by these outside forces, she being me. And I don't know how I forgive that. I want to stay open, and I almost didn't include anything about it in the book, but there's so many people going through this, these like terrible family rifts. And I just, when I read books and memoirs in particular, it's those sort of vulnerable moments that allow me to connect to the words on the page and draw some strength. And so I thought it was important for that reason. I don't share any of our private communication that we don't have anymore, but we did at one point. Yeah. I only share what was public, but we haven't spoken in well over a year.
Yeah. And, I've read a lot of your tweets in the book, and you have such a reasonable approach. And I tried as best I could to take that approach when I was tweeting about this. But if you'd read my tweets over the years, I get more and more pointed and angry, because I knew people were scared when I was first trying to communicate basically that there's a cost to all of these actions, and you're just ignoring what's happening to grandparents not seeing their grandchildren, and there's just a million things on that. Now, your husband Daniel was more pointed, perhaps, and
He was.
I don't disagree with either of you on this stuff. But that became a real flashpoint for you at the company.
Yeah. I mean, Daniel's a different person than I am. He expresses himself differently in actual real life as well. I have a well trained diplomatic voice. I try to build bridges. I don't know if it's my personality or having been a woman in corporate America for 30 years. You know, if I went around yelling at everybody all the time, I don't think that would have gone very well for me in my career. Um, you know, Daniel has a very forceful way of communicating. If people used to say to me, "Well, I'm sure that's just his persona on Twitter," I was like, "Oh, that's him. That's how he really is." And he didn't avoid any topics. I did. I avoided some topics that I had strong feelings about. I thought we could. I thought I could build a bridge around kids.
Hmm.
You know, I thought if there's anything, and that might give me them permission to talk about other things. I was strategic. I didn't talk about vaccine mandates. You know, my company had one or still has one. I wasn't going, yeah, I was trying. It may not seem like it, but I was kind of trying to keep my job while also keeping my beliefs intact and my voice and, you know, not selling myself out. But he was very vocal about discriminatory vaccine policies. He was very vocal when the signals became apparent that there were really serious side effects from vaccines. That's why he was kicked off Twitter. He's still kicked off. He's, you know, we're hoping he gets to come back.
Elon, if you're watching this,
Eli, yeah, I just said it on a show earlier today too. Bring Daniel Coatson back. You know, Naomi Wolf, Dr. Robert Malone. None of these folks are back yet, and they all were kicked off for saying things that are now provably true.
yeah,
Now, you might say, okay, who cares? It's silly. It's just Twitter, whatever. It's social media. But the fact is that the government used a private company as an arm of the government to censor people. This should be very alarming to all of us. And they were censored for saying things that are provably true. My husband, the tweet he got kicked off for was he said that these vaccines are causing myocarditis and strokes and blood clots. That they're side effects, known side effects. That's a fact. And then he stated an opinion at the end of that, and he said, "That's not what I call safe. Opinions are allowable. The first part is true." This should be alarming to all of us that the government would use a private company to censor citizens.
and by the way, it's you could characterize that tweet as criticizing pharmaceutical companies, but I like to remind people that it was the federal government was an explicit partner, perhaps the senior partner in the production and distribution and mandating of vaccination. So you have the Department of Homeland Security deciding that certain voices aren't allowed to be heard who are essentially criticizing the government. And that to me is as dangerous as it gets.
I agree with you. That's why this whole thing is as dangerous as it gets. And it's why people like you and I can't stop shouting from the rooftops about it. You know, I will say one of the other things I got in trouble for at the company was talking about the profit motive of big pharma, which, by the way, it's no secret. The primary motive of any company is profit.
Yeah.
It just is. That's the fiduciary responsibility. I mean, that's in the bylaws. That's your obligation. But I thought I was sly. I guess I wasn't that sly, you know, tweeting a little bit about pharma and Purdue and the opioid crisis. I was meant for it to be sort of an analogy that, you know, big pharma is in fact does not have all our best interests at heart, and they'll do anything basically to drive a sale. I was told I can't say that.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love Liberty and look cool. Yeah. Well, I would imagine that Levi's corporate office would love to cut a deal with the government where everyone was mandated to buy a pair of Levi's and then get boosted a couple times every year with the next version of Levi's, right?
Yeah, to guarantee that next sale.
Yeah,
Well, in this case, 3 or 4 times a year,
yeah.
not the next year, but
I mean that would
every
be
few
great.
months.
That would like, and this gets back to like trying to understand why corporate America has gone in this direction. I think it slides more into this mode over time where the profitability of a company becomes more and more intertwined with their relationship with the government, and do they know the
Yeah.
committee chairman, and that is obviously corrupting because that's no longer about serving consumers. That's about gaming the system, the way that Samuel, I can never.
Bankman
Thank
Fried.
you, thank you.
SBF. Yeah.
Someday I'm going to get that.
The thing that's really, well, it's also confusing is two sets of initials, FTX and SBF. Um, Another thing that was sort of just mind blowing to me is this, like the left, they loved criticizing big business for taking advantage of consumers, right? That
Yeah,
was like their thing. Regulation to protect consumers. And now it's pharma is nothing, has nothing but our best interests at heart. They would never try to sell you any drug or vaccine that would be harmful. They certainly wouldn't put these practices in place just to sell more. It's like, are you paying attention? Like, what? Honestly, do we need a more recent example than the opioid crisis? I think these companies are still paying out billions and billions of dollars. I saw another lawsuit this morning. Women are suing. I don't even know what company it is, for sort of hair straightening that's caused uterine cancer. Like, how much more proof do we need? And yet the left adopted this pro science religious stance that pharma always has our best interest at heart.
yeah. I remember you can go on YouTube and watch, particularly virtuous kids getting Pfizer tattoos. I never thought I'd see that one. That is strange. It's like a religious psychosis or something. And speaking of which, I want to go back to the family thing because when I was reading that chapter in your book, I was thinking about a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's been on this show a number of times, Lee Schooland, who grew up in China during Mao's Cultural Revolution. And she has horrific stories about how the government would divide families and pit them against each
Yeah.
other. And also, like, she can tell stories about how her next door neighbors beat up her mother
Yeah.
because she was not with the program, and the program was
Right.
whatever the government said. So so
Right.
so breaking up families here is more than just tragic. There's something systemic possibly going on here, and then now I'm starting to sound like a
No,
tinfoil
I
hat
think you're
guy.
right. I think it's a feature, not a bug. Is that the phrase? It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
What you described also describes East Germany. And, people were encouraged to tell on their neighbors and tell on their family members if they were seen to be violating whatever edict that could change at any moment that the government put forth. Um, but again, I think it's this denial of our to to prioritize the state above all else. You have to deny the individual, and you have to deny the humanity of the individual, which is often most present in your home with your family, right? So it's I think you're correct in how you described it earlier, and I guess what I struggle with is how conscious is this strategy on the part of those driving it. I mean, in San Francisco, neighbors were encouraged to turn in their neighbors if they had guests in their home.
Yeah.
People called the police on my family when we went to the park together. When they finally allowed us to go outside in groups, we weren't allowed to go outside in groups. What was permitted at that point was to go out just within your household. Well, I have a fairly large household. I have 4 children. 2 of my children are mixed race. We don't look like a traditional family. People called the police on us because they said you must be mixing households. I had to defend my family, these children as my children, to police officers.
That's just so disgusting. And that's the new left. So by the way, we should point out that You make it clear in the book that you're a lifelong Democrat and that you very much consider yourself a liberal, but you've left the 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 tribe, the cult, whatever it is. What are
Yeah.
you? Where? How would you describe yourself now?
Well, I'm not a Republican either. I'm not kind of going to flee one oppressive orthodoxy for what I perceive to be as another. I have been sort of embraced by the right. So, my general people are very critical of some of the folks I've chosen to talk to about my story. My view is I'll talk to anybody that is interested in this message, and if we disagree on some stuff, that's fine. I'm registered as unaffiliated in Colorado, which, by the way, 40% of the citizens here are. Um, and everybody always says that unaffiliated or independent is basically a Republican, just admit it. But Colorado has 40% unaffiliated, and we have a Democratic governor. And in fact, Polis has turned the state quite blue. But there is a real libertarian streak here, which leads me to my point is I think as I try to kind of figure out where I am in the wilderness, I lean mostly towards probably where you sit, which is libertarian and pro freedom. I recognize that a vote for a libertarian probably doesn't do me much good in the world of voting, but I just I can't really embrace either party. I don't want to embrace a kind of an orthodoxy that says you must tick all these boxes in order to be accepted by us. And so I'll just remain a free agent for now, that with the spirit of a libertarian, I think.
Yeah, it's frustrating to be politically homeless, and I do think that the one thing that I refuse to become is to join one party just so I can vote against the other guys, because that to me is the cancer that you're sort of otherizing these ideas. My half-baked theory as to why Republicans didn't do better in this last election is they weren't actually for something; they were just against things, and that definitely proved not to be enough.
I agree that that's 100% correct. They were um, against Democrats. They were against inflation. Well, who's not against inflation? But they didn't really offer real solutions. And I think what's interesting is, the two governors that won most decisively were Ron DeSantis and my governor, Jared Polis. And I don't want to get into Polis and what he did well and what he didn't, but he did the best of the Democratic governors, I would say. I mean, that's why we moved here. And both, in a sense, ran on freedom, and they had real policies that they had put into place. You can love or hate DeSantis. He stood up to the COVID narrative. He got kids in school. Old folks were allowed to have visitors in the hospital and not die alone. Beyond that, he raised teacher pay, and he lowered prescription drug prices for Floridians. Like, he is action oriented. Now he plays in the rhetoric and all that stuff too, but he did stuff that made the lives of Floridians better. And I think Polis did as well. They
Yeah.
both won by 20 points, and they both flipped their purple states, one red and the other blue. And I see a lot of Polis doesn't like it. I think Bill Maher said, I see some commonality between the two of you. And, Polis took umbrage at that. But I think it was an insightful comment
Yeah.
from Maher.
Yeah, like there's some authenticity there, and this is sort of my optimistic theory about where we're going from this hyper tribalism to some new political coalition seems to be emerging that I would call both anti-authoritarian and more live and let live. Let's focus on communities and working things out from the bottom up. And you're seeing like comedians like even Bill Maher. I used to go on Bill Maher a long time ago, and he would just call me all sorts of horrible names. But now I find very little that I disagree with him on, and I think you're seeing the old civil libertarian liberals and and people from across the political spectrum that are actually looking for something that is against this sort of monolithic top-down authoritarian thing that we seem to be becoming. And I think there's something interesting happening there. I'm not sure what it is.
I think that's right. I mean, I think I thought it was bigger than it was
Yeah.
already, because that's the group I find myself in. So fine, I'm in a bubble, I guess, maybe a little bit of a bubble. I thought it was bigger, and even if not really big, big enough to kind of shake things up a bit more in the election. I don't think that was the case. Um, I think, on a very practical level, I think the overturning of Roe did have an absolute impact. And I think that states that were uncompromising on that, I mean, I think this is another good example. Here, I'll give you the Polis example. Colorado is very libertarian. There's a lot of guns, there's a lot of weed, and you can get an abortion up to 40 weeks. I don't necessarily agree with getting abortions up to 40 weeks. I think that's incredibly problematic. But his point in saying that is he's standing on the side of freedom and a woman's ability to choose with her doctor. Same on guns and same on weed. And they legalize mushrooms here in Colorado as well. And so he very, very much is furthering this message of freedom. I think it is a growing coalition. I just think it's going to take longer than I thought for it to build into a meaningful voting bloc. And I think most people still defaulted to their typical ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It almost, the worse things get, it almost seems to push people back into their camps because they're so afraid of the other team. And that's sort of a dilemma. Certainly for the Libertarian Party, I think political independence. But like everything else, it's going to work itself out. I count on people.
I like your optimism. You're cheering me up. I gotta say.
This is the whole basis of my libertarianism is that people have a way, if left free enough, people always have a way to figure stuff out. And it's not necessarily pretty, but it's so much more effective for solving problems and creating innovation than it is when you give all the power to one guy, the smartest guy in the room, and he says, do this. And that's what we just went through with COVID. We saw the collateral damage caused by that. I just think we have to make the case for bottom-up, community-based problem solving, and for libertarians aren't so good at that either. We're constantly sort of yelling at the sky about the Federal Reserve and stuff like that. And I'm one of those guys, by the way.
I think my concern and what I see with the younger generations, and now I sound like an old fogey, get off my lawn type person. I feel like there's I've been trying to make this case for freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble. I didn't think it was a case I'd ever have to make, but it feels like, having gone through what we just went through, lots of people don't care that much about it, and they're willing to give it up in exchange for a feeling of belonging and safety, whether or not they actually are safer, the feeling of safety. And that's what's been really alarming for me, because the oldsters like us are making this case and screaming about freedom, and young people are like, meh.
Yeah. The mob and your whole story is about that. Like these are people that turned on you that you probably never imagined they would, and once they're a mob instead of free thinking individuals, it gets really dangerous.
Yeah,
that's a really dark way to end this conversation.
Yeah, I was like, you were leaving me on a high note, but and to be clear, that mob there was a Twitter mob, but there was an employee mob, and there were people calling the ethics hotline. Like, this went from virtual to real life very quickly. And in fact, I think the real life mob had an even greater impact, because employees, and it wasn't a lot of them, this is what's also sort of kind of mind-boggling about it all, is a handful of employees were sending emails that they were upset with me to the CEO. I still don't, for the life of me, understand why he couldn't stand up and say, I got your email. She's a mom. She gets to say what she wants to say. She's not saying it on behalf of the company. Get back to work, which is essentially what Ted Sarandos, the CEO from Netflix, said when employees, there were supposed to be thousands at this protest, to take Chappelle off the platform. And I think there were like 12.
Yeah.
And he said, enough, go back to work.
Yeah.
Leave if you want. I don't really see, and he knew that was good business to do that. And it worked, frankly. I don't think there was a mass exodus from the company. And when I say good business, he meant we have a lot of stuff we're going to show, because lots of different kinds of people who like lots of different kinds of things watch Netflix. We're going to appeal to the most people possible. If you don't like that, you don't need to work here. I don't really understand why more leaders can't do that. I think it quiets fairly quickly when you do that, when you exhibit just the tiniest degree of common sense and, I guess to some extent, courage.
Yeah.
But they